I'm Katie Murphy.
My name is Everett Pope.
My name's Joshua. I am an AmeriCorps Vista.
I'm an AmeriCorps Vista.
I work for Groundwork, Rhode Island.
And this is our workshop about soil health.
What kind of nutrients need to be present in the soil in order for plants to thrive? The answer to this question is actually quite complex. Plants need some nutrients in large amounts and other nutrients in small amounts. We call the nutrients that plants uptake in large amounts from the soil macronutrients. Those are things like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium. But plants also need some nutrients in smaller quantities. These are things like zinc, boron, iron, manganese. For the purposes of this workshop, we're going to focus mostly on macronutrients. That's nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, NPK. NPK are abbreviations that come from the periodic table of the elements. Plants take these nutrients up in large quantities every year, and so they need to be replaced if you're going to grow plants in the same soil again next year. If you think about an environment where humans aren't removing plants from the soil, such as a forest, in the forest, a plant might produce a fruit. That fruit might fall and rot on the ground. If it doesn't rot, it might be eaten by an animal. That animal might defecate on the ground, and that returns nutrients to the soil. And eventually, the animal will die, and the animal's body then returns nutrients to the soil. But if we're removing any part of a plant from an agricultural setting, even if we leave almost all of the parts of the plant except the part we're harvesting, we still need to return some nutrients to the soil. And that's where fertilizers, such as chemical fertilizer, fish emulsion, blood meal, all these sorts of things, manures, or compost come into play. If you've ever purchased fertilizer at a store, you know that most commercial fertilizers have a ratio known as NPK on their packaging. That stands for nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Those are the abbreviations from the periodic table of the elements. The reason that farmers and gardeners are so concerned with NPK is that without these nutrients, your plants may be stunted, have low growth, and low fruit yields. But what happens when the fertilizers that are meant for our soils end up in fresh and salt water? In fact, studies show that this happens quite frequently. Up to 65% of chemical fertilizers do not actually enter the soil and run off when it rains into the watershed. When nitrogen enters saltwater, it creates algae blooms which choke fish and cause huge die-offs. When phosphorus enters freshwater, it also causes problems. In Rhode Island, with Narragansett Bay, we have brackish water, which is salt and fresh. So we really do have to pay attention to both our nitrogen and our phosphorus use in the state. Nitrogen and phosphorus are both crucial ingredients in agriculture, but they also have implications for the health of the bay. That means that we have to be smart about how we're balancing the health of our soil and the health of our water. Nitrogen and phosphorus are crucial ingredients in agriculture, but also cause problems when they reach our bay. Our task then is a subtle one. We have to balance the needs of our soil with the health of our water. And it's not just big farms that can play a part in this. Your lawn, your garden, and how you treat them can play a part as well. Transitioning to a smarter way of taking care of our plants involves a shift in how we're thinking about everything we do when we're farming and gardening. From how we plant to how we protect our plants from pests to what we do with the soil when there's no plants there at all. It means that we actually have to begin to try to truly, deeply understand the complex world of the soil. Chemical fertilizers may seem like a one-stop shop to keep your plants healthy and strong. But actually, they're just feeding the plants in the short term rather than strengthening the soil in the long term, and it's not a diverse diet. In fact, because chemical fertilizers contain large amounts of very specific nutrients, then those nutrients actually favor certain microorganisms in the soil over others and create a lack of diversity over time. Compost is a really important element, a central element in a more regenerative type of agriculture. It contains nutrients that exist in a substrate already. Basically, it's dirt infused with life and nutrients, as opposed to chemical fertilizers that are just pure nutrients that have to be sprinkled on top of the dirt and then have to sink in. Because of this, compost is much less likely to wash up in a rainstorm. It already has those nutrients in a stable state. Additionally, compost has an incredible capacity to hold onto water. In fact, it can hold up to 5 times its weight in water. That means that not only does it help make your soil more drought resistant, but it also is much less likely to wash away in a rainstorm. But it's important to remember that compost is not a one-to-one replacement for chemical fertilizer. In fact, it works completely differently and has to be used in concert with several other best management practices. We'll try to give a basic overview of what that looks like in this video.
Compost is a life-giving resource. Now, when I say that, I mean that not only does compost support the life of the soil, which supports the life of the plants we cultivate, which support our lives so that we can support each other's, I mean that inside of compost there are living organisms that essentially give energy to this cycle of interactions. It is important to discuss what compost is and how it is made at a basic level. So we take all these materials, called feedstocks, as they are literally food, mix them all together, and eventually they turn into an amendment that resembles rich soil. It contains nutrients and properties that can improve our growing practices. Microorganisms and insects such as bacteria, fungi, and worms are working together to turn these materials into a form that can be used by our plants. As composters, what we are trying to do is create as ideal of an environment as possible for these organisms to thrive. Compost is distinct from soil in that it is a managed process. We are encouraging what happens naturally, the decomposition of living and non-living things. In our case, we use food scraps, leaves, and wood chips in an active recipe that is managed through aeration. Aerating, or turning the pile, incorporates oxygen that the organisms within need to live. This, in combination with other controllable factors such as moisture content and density, improve the effectiveness of the composting process. Once compost is finished processing and has cured, it is in a stable form and packed with nutrients that become more plant accessible over time. It has a large organic matter content, which can be thought of as the total amount of living and decomposing and dead living things inside of the soil. Organic matter plays a critical role in soil health. I like to think of compost as a soil conditioner rather than a replacement for fertilizer. It improves plant health by improving soil health, whereas fertilizer improves plant productivity by supplying those plants with nutrients that are immediately accessible. The same organisms that were cultivated in the pile inoculate a host soil through compost application. Using organic matter as habitat and energy source, they create synergistic relationships with plants, making the nutrient cycle even more efficient. This is a slow and gradual process, but one that improves upon itself. Though only around 10 to 25% of the nitrogen from added compost is available within the first year, the nitrogen and other nutrient requirements of your plants can be supplemented temporarily by other natural fertilizers such as blood meal, fish emulsion, and diluted urea. As we move into the second, third, and later years of compost application, we start to see its additive and regenerative nature start to strengthen. The nutrients that were locked up in a prior year become available in the next year. Soil aggregates formed from the heightened organic matter have a greater capacity to hold on to these nutrients and keep them from escaping in water runoff. The compost itself has incredible water retention, and the organic matter content contributes to massive amounts of carbon drawdown. With nutrients from chemical fertilizers running off into our local waterways and eventually our oceans, causing immense environmental detriment, yes, we can use compost as a preventative measure and a solution, but most importantly, as a means of healing. So, you know how amazing compost is, you're on board, you want to use it, but how do you use it? How much do you use? What is the best compost application method for your personal situation? A great way to understand the state of your soil and how to improve its health is through soil testing. A routine soil test, or soil nutrient analysis, is going to tell you most of what you need to know. Soil pH, nutrient levels and fertilizer recommendations, levels of lead and other toxic heavy metals, and the right soil amendments to use to avoid polluting waterways. These tests are available close by at the University of Connecticut and the University of Massachusetts for a nominal fee. They also offer additional tests, such as testing for organic matter content, nitrate content, soluble salts, and more. Locally, we have URI, which conducts a free soil testing service. It will tell you the pH levels and texture of your soil, from which many generalizations and inferences can be made. For example, the availability of nutrients correlates with the soil's pH. Balancing a soil pH between 6 and 7 will typically enable your soil to uptake the greatest amount and the greatest diversity of nutrients. Once you have the information to work with, it's a matter of cross-referencing and analyzing to determine what the best soil amendments are for you to use. Commercial compost products should tell you their nutrient contents, from which you can compare to your test results and determine the amount that you need. Always apply compost based on the phosphorus needs of your soil. Applying in an attempt to meet the nitrogen requirements of your soil will almost always result in an oversaturation of phosphorus and potassium, which, as we've seen, can cause extreme environmental detriment and also damage to your plants. If you're not as savvy with this sort of information, there are many widely accepted practices that you can use as a starting point. When remediating land for the first time to grow in-ground, we definitely recommend getting your soil tested to determine whether or not it's safe for growing. If your soil is safe and no further remedial actions are necessary, you can generally apply compost in a 1-to-1 ratio. That is, 1 part compost for every 1 part of existing soil. One question that comes to mind is to till or not to till. Tillage is essentially any preparatory action that agitates the soil, such as mixing, digging, turning. When we do this, it damages soil structures and beneficial microbial networks. During tillage, the rich topsoil and any added compost get mixed in with those deeper layers that have a much lower organic matter content. This would dilute all of the organic matter content that you're starting with, taking it away from the very important root zone. The combination of these disruptions leads to accelerated surface runoff and erosion, poor water infiltration and retention, and lower nutrient exchange. That being said, the benefits of tilling in compost potentially outweigh the loss of bacterial and fungal networks depending on your situation. In the case of low organic matter content, say below 4%, or soils with poor drainage, tilling in compost might actually be necessary to restore growing conditions. In the case of tending previously cultivated spaces, such as small gardens or farms, or soils that have a greater organic matter content, it is likely that intensive tillage should be avoided to preserve those crucial bacterial and fungal networks. If the ground soil is lead contaminated, or if you and other growers can't bend down to cultivate an in-ground garden, you may want to build a raised bed. When building the soil and raised beds, you have the benefit of knowing exactly what's going into it. But there is also a greater chance of creating a nutrient imbalance since the soil system is either completely or partially closed. You're essentially creating a habitat from scratch, so you can think of these as very large potted plants. Placing raised beds on top of soil is ideal because you're creating contact between the wider soil food web and the soil inside of the beds. If you must place the bed on pavement, permeable pavers are preferable and can improve drainage. Also, make sure your raised beds are at least 12 to 18 inches tall to allow your plant roots plenty of room to grow. There are all sorts of tried and true mixes for garden beds. 2 parts topsoil to 1 part compost, 6 parts topsoil to 3 parts compost to 1 part vermiculite, 1 part loam to 1 part compost. There are a lot of combinations, and though these recommendations exist, you will likely find what works best in your situation through experimentation. Beyond this, I think it's most important to get your materials from reliable sources so that you know exactly what they contain. Of course, this is all information based on personal experience and research, which I encourage everyone to do. Ask other growers what methods they've used and what's been successful for them. Get your soil tested and build a deeper understanding about it. Trust generational and ancestral knowledge and your instincts when there are seemingly no answers to be found.
Many people have established growing areas, whether in ground or in raised beds. When maintaining existing cultivated soil, there are few practices that can significantly contribute to long-term soil health. For yearly compost application, we recommend that you, instead of tilling, we recommend that you apply 1 to 2 inches of compost on the topsoil so that you don't disrupt the flow of things as like they go on, because there's like a whole different world underneath there. And also you want to do this preferably like in the fall time, because what will happen is that it'll allow the nutrients to kind of like be absorbed by the soil, and your plants will be able to receive the full benefit of it. Because if you do this kind of like hastily, you run the chance of like nitrogen burning your plants. Young annuals and seedlings are like very, very sensitive to compost, so may be adversely affected by compost. Try to put the soil down like a week or 2 before you incorporate these things into your garden. Since different plants uptake different nutrients, and since different plants take different nutrients away from the soil, it's just a clever thing to do to yearly rotate your crops. A way to keep track of it is by keeping like a crop rotation chart, so that you can kind of like be like, okay, last year I planted carrots over here, maybe this time I'll do tomatoes over here, and it kind of acts as like a natural defense system within your soil and for your plant. And then just like more generally, diversifying your plants. Katie made a beautiful analogy actually, like during the presentation, which was consider like this whole thing as like a building. And it's like you have a building and it has like an empty building is just that building, and air flows through it, and that's it. But if you fill that building with people, you kind of create like these diverse cultures. You create like these businesses, these shops, these schools, whatever it may be, and like that like natural like diversity that occurs like just in life like refortifies the soil. So once you're on board with compost, a lot of people just don't know how to use it. A great way, definitely, we recommend like if you're doing this indirectly in the soil, because a lot of the folks that we speak to are community gardeners, so more likely than not they're going to be operating in raised beds. If you're doing it in the soil for the first time, then we highly recommend getting a soil test. It's like very, very, very important. And especially like in the urban areas where there's been like a history of like just crazy industrialization that just kind of damages the soil underneath, concrete, pavement, all of these things that kind of like add to like the damaging of the soil. We would recommend that once you get the soil tested and once they come back, most likely they're going to be kind of poor, compost the soil at a 1-to-1 ratio. Many people have established growing areas in raised beds or directly in the soil. Here's just a couple of recommendations to kind of help that process. For yearly compost application, we highly recommend that you apply 1 to 2 inches of compost on top of the soil, so you don't necessarily have to till your land. You don't have to disrupt what's going on underneath there. And then it also kind of serves as like a conditioner, but then it also serves as something that's like fortifying the strength of your soil. We highly recommend that you do it in the fall prior to the spring, because still there might be some volatile organic components that exist in the compost, and you don't necessarily want that to damage or nitrogen burn your plants. Heavy feeders such as like cucumbers, corn, melon, tomato, they have the tendency, like in their name, to just suck up all the nutrients. So it's just a general rule to apply compost on top of any bed or area that was previously like inhabited by these heavy feeders. More generally, kind of like the world we exist in, it's just smarter to kind of have like a diverse amount of plants. So even if you have liking towards one particular plant group, it would be wise that you do multiple particular plant groups, because bug or like blight or something like that could potentially knock out your whole. We help each other out.
There's something magical that happens when we get our hands dirty, touching and connecting with the soil, letting it know that we are here as stewards for the land and, by extension, the oceans. Healthy soils make for a healthy world. Compost is a way for us to get in touch with our nature.
Compost is really important to me because of the potential it has transformationally for the way we live with the earth.
Compost to me, this is like a very active way to kind of cut down on the toxins and the carbon that we put out into the earth. So it's very impactful, very, very impactful.